all in the name of cocaine and heroin and cannabis. The killers that you're about to meet, who were all sent down in 2025, are behind the 10 most shocking and vicious gangland murders to have unravelled in the UK in recent times. Enjoy. There is one car behind. They will kill me. These were the last words of 26-year-old Anselam Senaj before he was attacked on the evening of the 11th of November 2023. Soon after he made this call out, the taxi in which he was travelling as a backseat passenger was forcibly stopped by a silver Mitsubishi in Victoria Avenue in Newham, East London. Having immediately jumped out of the Mitsubishi, 3 of the 6 occupants surrounded the taxi and attacked the victim, who was still in his seat. The black-clad attackers were wearing masks and gloves, 2 of them wielding knives up to 2 feet long. Now viewer, if I've got you hooked on the story so far, do subscribe, give the video a like, drop a comment when you're ready and donate. Hit the thanks button below, I'll appreciate you. After one of the men stabbed Mr. Senaj in the chest, all 3 hurried back into the Mitsubishi and took flight. Despite the efforts of emergency services, who were immediately called, Mr. Senaj died at the scene. The next day, the car, which turned out to have been stolen, was found burned out. Drugs. That was the reason for the murder. The specifics of the drugs matter, however, aren't known. The perpetrators never said. At trial, what prosecutor Alexandra Healy KC argued was, quote, "It appears from the drugs subsequently found on Mr. Senaj and messages received from his phone that he was involved in drug dealing. When Mr. Senaj saw the Mitsubishi coming towards him, he clearly recognised he was in danger and told the taxi driver that the occupants would kill him. Sadly, he was absolutely right in his assessment of their interest," unquote. The court was told that Mohammed Saqib Khan, 24, from Enfield, had inflicted the fatal wound. Meanwhile, it was alleged that Mohammed Samuel Mia, 19, from Manor Park, and Zain Ali, 22, from East Ham, were the other 2 attackers. Lastly, the getaway driver was said to have been Ibrahim Naim, 18, who, like Ali, came from East Ham. Mia, Ali and Naim were arrested in November 2023. As for Khan, after the murder, by the way, Khan not only perpetrated the stabbing but also instigated the whole attack on the victim, fled to Amsterdam. In January 2024, however, he was extradited back to the UK. Having all pled not guilty, the 4 defendants were subsequently convicted in a trial that took place at the Old Bailey in London, and which exposed a shocking twist relating to one of the 4 defendants. Convicted of murder, ringleader Khan got life with a minimum of 26 years. Having been cleared of murder but convicted of manslaughter, Ali, who also stole the victim's phone, was jailed for 14 years. Having been convicted, like Ali, of manslaughter, Naim got 10 years and 6 months. Now, as for Mia, he might have got less than the 25 years that he was given if it hadn't been for his previous act of knocking a girl out in a North London park in March 2023, which he did in the course of his accompanying hour-long grape of the victim, who I believe was 15. Die in jail, please, Mia. And Khan, Ali and Naim, the same goes for you.
Tommy was stabbed to death in Semelong Park shortly before midnight on the 18th of July last year. His attackers, Daniel Larman and Kieran Okocha-Sleight, will now spend the majority of their adult life in prison.
Which is because those 2 perpetrators, who, like all the antagonists that we've so far met in this presentation, took a man's life for nothing, according to the facts that I've unearthed at any rate, have since been jailed for life. Shortly before midnight on the said date, Larman and Okocha-Sleight, who were both 21 and who were both drug dealers, met up with a woman at Miller's Meadow, also known as Semelong Park, in Northampton, East England, to sell her drugs. At the moment when Okocha-Sleight was sitting on a bench next to the woman and Larman was standing in front of her, 30-year-old father of 1, Tommy Boom, along with another man, approached the group and asked the 2 men what they were doing. When Larman then pulled out a large hunting knife from his waistband, after asking him what he was going to do with it, Tommy told him to put it down. Seconds later, Tommy was lying on the ground, having suffered 2 stab wounds, the one in the side of his chest, killing him on the scene, despite the rapid and concerted intervention of paramedics. I don't know what the woman mentioned did, either during or after the murder. As for the 2 perpetrators, straight after killing the stranger, they filmed the murder weapon with the victim's blood on it, adding a banner that read, quote, "Just had to juice a guy up," unquote. They then sent the video to an associate of theirs, along with a second video of blood-stained trainers with 3 laughing emojis. As if that wasn't callous and offensive enough, at about 8:40 a.m. that morning, Larman filmed himself walking past the crime scene. His next act, though, was to flee to Birmingham, where, according to his courtroom testimony, he dumped both his blood-stained clothing and his murder weapon in a West Midlands canal. Both he and Okocha-Sleight were no less arrested the very next day. Despite providing no comment in his formal police interviews, during his January 2025 trial, Larman claimed that he killed Tommy, who was unarmed, in self-defence, as Tommy had allegedly previously robbed Okocha-Sleight. He argued that on seeing his victim, he instantly assumed that he'd been set up for Tommy to get to again. This, however, was rapidly proven to be bullshit. I believe Okocha-Slaight's own liability for Tommy's murder derives from the principle of joint enterprise, a category of accessorial liability where only the mens rea, the mental element of a crime, usually meaning intention, along with the absence of a valid defence, are needed. On the 12th of May 2025 at Northampton Crown Court, he got life with a minimum of 21 years. Daniel Larman, meanwhile, the actual knifeman, got life with a minimum of 24 years. Where he at least is concerned, what an insulting sentence. The way in which, on the date of the 14th of April 2023 in the Springburn area of Glasgow in Scotland, 25-year-old Michael Day murdered Thomas Bowers, aged 33, and attempted to murder Stephen Byrne feels like something out of a movie. Aged 24 at the time of his offences and under the protection currently of an anonymity order, meaning that no pictures of the man have so far been published, Day grew up in an environment in which, quote, "violence was normalised as a means of resolving conflict," unquote. That said, before his acts of April 2023, the man had no convictions for violent offences at least. Day was a drug dealer who, up to the 14th of April 2023, had been using a tenanted flat in Springburn, Glasgow, as a base from which to store and supply controlled drugs. The tenant of the flat, who we'll call Tony, will unquestionably have gained in some way, like by getting free drugs or by getting money, for allowing his home to be used for drug dealing, this practice being fairly common and being commonly known as cuckooing. In the early morning of the 14th of April 2023, 2 masked men and a woman arrived at the flat, woke Tony up and demanded to know where the drugs were. On getting notice about what was going on at his business premises, Day got into his Vauxhall Astra, the man not actually having been qualified to drive and only holding a provisional licence then, by the way, and made his way round there. On seeing, just as he was pulling up to the flat, the 3 intruders emerging from the flat and then walking down the street, Peters Hill Road, Day proceeded to mount the pavement on the wrong side of the road and knock down the 2 men, Mr. Bowers and Mr. Byrne. Mr. Bowers couldn't get up, the man dying soon after, in fact, at the scene. But Mr. Byrne could, and he did, only for the perpetrator to reverse the Vauxhall Astra and plough into him once again. Lord Harrower, who presided over Day's murder trial, described the perpetrator's acts as a, quote, "deliberate, sustained attack," unquote. The Vauxhall Astra was later found burnt out in Ridgeway, northeast Glasgow, Day himself having taken flight in his motor after his second attack on his 2 victims, but then having returned straight after to where the 2 bodies were lying before heading away to Ridgeway. He then fled to a caravan park in Ayrshire and got rid of a SIM card from a phone that he'd been using. I don't know how the woman who had accompanied Mr. Bowers and Mr. Byrne avoided being hit. She must have just not been in the way of the car. And I also don't know what she did when she saw her 2 companions getting knocked down. I'm assuming that she actually saw that. If she didn't, why didn't she? It turns out that while some passers-by came to the aid of the two men and called the emergency services, certain others took to rifling through the pockets of the fallen Mr. Bowers. Equally disturbingly, when he sentenced day, Lord Harrower revealed that the court knew very little about Mr. Bowers, having not actually received a victim impact statement from the man's family. As for the survivor, having been rendered wheelchair-bound by the perpetrator's attack, Mr. Byrne also has some permanent disfigurement along with other permanent injuries. Lord Harrower said that Day had shown no remorse for his acts and that, furthermore, he didn't even seem to realise how serious his acts were. I think that's what the judge meant when he stated today, quote, "You appear to have no insight into your offending," unquote. On the 10th of July 2025 at Edinburgh High Court, Lord Harrower gave Day life with a minimum of 20 years. Even when 42-year-old drug smuggler Tahir Syed, who comes from Halifax, West Yorkshire in the northwest, went on the run abroad after kidnapping, torturing and murdering his very own uncle, 39-year-old bus driver Asghar Badshah, he carried on his drug trafficking operations. When, on the 29th of November 2019, alongside 4 of his henchmen, if you will, he bundled Mr. Badshah into a Mercedes in Bradford, drove him to a disused bank over in Batley and beat the you-know-what out of him, Syed was, in fact, on something of a break as an international fugitive. In September 2019, Syed's so-called right-hand man, Yusuf Kara, 36, as well as another member of Syed's gang, Imran Khan Ashraf, also 36, were spotted in Bradford by either the police or NCA, National Crime Agency, officers, or both possibly, moving heavy bags between at least 2 vehicles. On subsequently being arrested over in Bolton, Greater Manchester, Ashraf was found to have around £130,000 in cash hidden in his car. Law enforcement seized not only the cash, but also the 4 mobile phones that Ashraf was carrying. When, later that same afternoon, Kara was arrested, NCA officers found no fewer than 51 kilos of heroin in his home, while police officers took possession of the 2 mobile phones that the man had in his possession. The said 51 kilos of heroin were nothing, you might say, compared to the tons of that drug, plus, similarly, the shed loads of cocaine that Syed and his gang shipped into the UK in containers of frozen chicken, no less, between 2016 and 2021. And see, I told you the perpetrator continued his drug trafficking business even while he was on the run for murder. I think you can work out what else he was on the run for. Anyway, having rapidly learned of the arrests of 2 of his gang members, Syed didn't hang around for law enforcement to discover, through any one or more of the 6 mobile phones that they had seized, if not through direct disclosures from Ashraf and Kara themselves, his involvement in the gang and its drug smuggling operations. Just before scarpering abroad, as he did 2 days later, Syed got his uncle to hide £600,000 in cash, which the perpetrator had made from his drug smuggling, of course, for him. To this day, it isn't known who nicked the money from the car inside the garage of Mr. Badshah's mother's home, which was where Mr. Badshah stashed it. In response to both Syed's fury at the theft of his money and at the man's intention to get him to take a lie detector test to see if he was the one who had stolen from him, Mr. Badshah texted his nephew to say, quote, "I'm in fear of my life. I couldn't sleep all night. I'm shaking writing these messages. Please let me sit the lie detector and show it's not me. I never went near the garage and don't want to be involved in your dealings and never did." Unquote. Mr. Badshah took not 1 but 2 lie detector tests, his nephew having returned to the country to get him to take the tests. The bank that Mr. Badshah was taken to on the 29th of November 2019, a former branch of Yorkshire Bank, was owned by a so-called associate of Syed and was undergoing renovation. When he was carried away by all of 5 violent thugs to the place, Mr. Badshah had just arrived at his mother's house in Bradford after finishing his shift at Brickhouse bus station. His body was found hidden on a shelving unit inside a vault in the bank on the 29th of December 2019, a month after his murder. Police had gone looking for the victim after he was reported missing by none other than his identical twin brother. A post-mortem examination found that Mr. Badshaw had been whacked with a blunt object, which was later identified as a metal rod, at least 48 times on his head, neck, torso and all 4 limbs. It was a sustained assault. The victim had been tortured all through the night. Mr. Badshaw, as you've presumably gathered, failed both of his lie detector tests, which, for his nephew, could only mean one thing. On the 5th of December 2019, a week after beating his uncle to death, Syed scarpered first to Albania, then to Kosovo and lastly to Turkey, all using a false North Macedonian passport. He and his gang then smuggled 200 kilos of heroin and cocaine into the UK. But in August 2020, they had their 155 kilo cocaine shipment that was destined for the Netherlands intercepted and seized by the Dutch authorities. Following a global manhunt, Syed was arrested in Turkey on the 11th of November 2021. After his ensuing 2-year battle against extradition, he was finally brought back to the UK to stand trial. Before the man's own trial, many of his gang members had already been banged up themselves, including Yusuf Kara and Imran Khan Ashraf, plus the 4 who took part in Mr. Badshaw's kidnap. The 34-year minimum term of imprisonment that Syed was given as a life sentence at Leeds Crown Court on the 13th of June 2025 was for Mr. Badshaw's kidnap, torture and murder, as well as for the perpetrator's drug trafficking. Given what he did to his uncle, though, his own flesh and blood, in my opinion, the man should have just been given a whole life prison sentence. For the murder of 30-year-old Shaquille Graham in Catford, South London on the 10th of March 2024, 19-year-old Tyler Roberts-Emmanuel, who was 18 at the time of his act, is now doing life. A drug dealer by trade, specialising in the supply of cannabis, around the 6th of March 2024, Roberts-Emmanuel paid $2,500 for the high-powered Carber Wolf Warrior electric scooter, which could travel up to 60 miles per hour, which he used to get to and from the location of his act of murder, which was a nightclub in Catford called Silks. From this same date, the perpetrator was only ever seen out on the street with his face and head covered up. He often wore gloves to minimise leaving fingerprints and used cash to make it harder for his movements to be tracked. All these actions of Roberts-Emmanuel served as concrete evidence in court of the premeditated nature of his offence against Mr. Graham. In line with this, at 7 p.m. on the 9th of March 2024, Roberts-Emmanuel left 153 Linden Grove SE15 wearing black clothing, his head and face duly being covered up, and got on his Wolf Warrior e-scooter and travelled to Catford. This was a dummy run or dry run for the murder, the journey having taken him about 6 minutes. The perpetrator remained in the area for about an hour while his cousin, who we'll call Lee, and Lee's friend, who we'll call Sean, were also in that area. Then, having since returned to SE15, just before 4 a.m. on the following day, the 10th of March 2024, the perpetrator arrived back in Catford on his e-scooter, having brought with him his Turkish Carlos Arms KSO-1 self-loading pistol in order to shoot Mr. Graham dead. The perpetrator then waited by a bus stop, watching people leaving Silks, before finally spotting Mr. Graham crossing the road with a young lady by the name of Sade Chaplin. The perpetrator followed the two into Bromley Road and waited until Mr. Graham was no longer in physical contact with his female companion. Having now approached Mr. Graham from behind, the perpetrator shot him once in the back of the head before returning to his e-scooter and promptly taking flight. The perpetrator worked so fast that Miss Chaplin didn't even see him. The killer's single shot naturally caused Mr. Graham to immediately fall to the ground, and there was nothing that the emergency services, who were duly called and who duly rapidly arrived, could do to save him. What is known is that the perpetrator didn't act alone. What isn't known, however, is why he did what he did. At no point between arrest and conviction, you see, did the perpetrator, who had pleaded not guilty to murder and who said it wasn't him who killed Mr. Graham, say. On the 4th of April 2025, Roberts-Emmanuel got life with a minimum of 28 years. Let him not f***ing survive it. It's around 10:15 p.m. on the 15th of September 2024, and 19-year-old Ben Proctor from Peterborough in the east of England is out on his bike minding his own business, maybe. Out of nowhere, the youth is suddenly rammed off his bike by a car which sends him flying. Next, his attackers, 2 men, come over and drag their unconscious victim out from underneath a hedge and chuck him into the boot of their car. An hour and a half later, the young man is dead. Who were his attackers and why did they knock him off his bike, abduct him, falsely imprison him and then kill him? This is, as you can probably see, our second story of a murder where the murder weapon is none other than a car. The second significant similarity between this murder and the one carried out by Michael Day is drugs. On catching Mr. Proctor breaking into a car compound, an act which the youth, who was a father, carried out in search of drugs, 34-year-old Akko Mohammed called his friend Shwan Sabah, 24, who stored vehicles at the site. After rushing to the site and picking Mohammed up in his red Kia Soul, Sabah had to reverse out of the hedge that he ended up driving into after chasing Mr. Proctor and then knocking him off his bike. Sabah hadn't actually braked, you see. Rather than calling emergency services, Sabah and Mohammed drove to First Drove in Fengate with the victim in the boot, where they met up with Zamka Mohammed Majid, 48, and Hawker Mohammedi, 40. Those 2 men helped to cover up the crime and destroy evidence. Mohammed called 999 after he and Sabah both then returned to the car compound. His emergency call came after he believed that his victim had died. The man relating to the call handler that he had gone to the compound, which he said he rented to store vehicles, after receiving phone CCTV notifications and seeing that there were intruders, and that on arrival he had found a young man sitting on the ground asking for water, and that after going to get the youth some water and then returning, he had found the young man unresponsive, prompting his, Mohammed's, 999 call. The wealth of CCTV evidence that there was to prove that this story was a pack of lies was amazing. And it's crazy that Mohammed and the others ever seriously thought that they could fool the police. On the 11th of July 2025 at Cambridge Crown Court, Mohammed Majid and Mohammedi each got 2 years and 9 months for false imprisonment and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. Mohammed got a 16-year minimum sentence, the full sentence being 24 years, for manslaughter, false imprisonment and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. Sabah got life with a minimum of 20 years for murder, false imprisonment and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. Ben Proctor, whose family say was vulnerable and easily led, was murdered in the middle of committing a break-in, a criminal offence. You don't get the death penalty for that criminal offence though. This is Liam Matthews. He's 26. For most of 2024, he was in jail for violent disorder, having kicked and stamped on a man in a street fight. But on the 18th of September 2024, he was released early because of prison overcrowding. Just hours later, on the very same day that he was released, he killed this man, Lewis Bell, a man that he'd known for years and a man who used to be his friend. Matthews killed his 26-year-old victim on the 8th birthday of the man's son. In Matthews' trial of March 2025, which took place at Teesside Crown Court, North East England, the jury heard that Matthews' savage act against Mr. Bell came from a dispute that unravelled in a crack you-know-what then. Believing that Mr. Bell had been stealing from other customers, Matthews flew into a violent rage, triggering Mr. Bell to make a speedy exit from the property in question and run for his life. Having been relentlessly chased by no fewer than 3 aggressors in fact, Mr. Bell had his final moments captured on a doorbell camera in Norton-on-Hills Drive. Having ignored the victim's pleas for his life, 23-year-old Sean McLeod was convicted in March 2025 of the murder of Mr. Bell, the man having perpetrated a 5-inch stab wound to Mr. Bell's back, which penetrated Mr. Bell's lung. Mr. Bell died minutes after suffering this stab wound on account of the catastrophic blood loss that it caused him. 18-year-old Ashton White and 26-year-old Liam Matthews, meanwhile, were found guilty of manslaughter. Having served only part of his sentence for violent disorder, Matthews was released from HMP Holme House under the government's early release scheme, which was intended to free up prison spaces. On the day of his release, Matthews met with probation officers and attended an appointment at a job centre before going to a pub and then to the crack house, where he spent £130 of his savings plus his £96 prison release grant on crack you-know-what. He was arrested the day after he, along with the said two other perpetrators, killed Mr. Bell. In a statement, the MOJ, Ministry of Justice, told one news channel, 5 News, quote, "We had no choice but to introduce an emergency early release programme. We did so with protections in place, including exclusions for those serving sentences for serious and violent crimes. Like with all serious further offences, this case will be investigated fully so that we can take action where necessary," unquote. So you excluded people from the early release scheme if they were serving sentences for serious violent crimes. I'm sorry, but isn't stamping on someone's head and kicking them in a street fight a serious and violent crime? Because, my dear Ministry of Justice, that is why Liam Matthews was f***ing in prison, so why the f*** did you release him? On the 19th of June 2025 at Teesside Crown Court, White got 10 years in youth detention for manslaughter, Matthews got 15 years for manslaughter, McLeod got 23 years as a minimum term of his life sentence for murder. This is Manchester gangster John Belfield getting busted for murder in March 2024 after coming back from Suriname in South America, where he'd got himself banged up.
You're under arrest for the following offences. You're under arrest on suspicion of murder, conspiracy to murder, manslaughter, conspiracy to rob and conspiracy to supply Class A drugs.
With John Belfield's July 2025 conviction for the July 2022 torture murder of 38-year-old drug dealer Thomas Campbell in Manchester, northwest England, we have finally been able to fill in the gaps in the story of the murder that were left by the first murder trial. Belfield's reason for organising and joining in with the torture and murder of Thomas Campbell was sexual jealousy. A secondary goal of his, though, once he learned who his ex-girlfriend, a woman called Demi Lee Driver, had started seeing, was to get some of Campbell's drug trade, because he himself was a drug dealer. It was to Belfield's good fortune that Colleen Campbell, Thomas Campbell's ex-wife, hated her ex-husband, who was the father of her 2 youngest children. What had led to Thomas's and Colleen's divorce was Thomas's affair with Colleen's best friend, who we'll call Tammy. When Colleen found out about her husband's affair, she went round Tammy's house and trashed the woman's car. After getting divorced, Colleen started treating Thomas well again, but was secretly still full of anger and hatred for him. When, in June 2025 then, Belfield got in touch with Colleen via Instagram regarding getting back at Thomas, he of course found the woman more than happy to collude with his vicious plan. With the information provided by Colleen relating to Thomas's lifestyle and daily movements, Belfield was able to get a tracker fitted to Thomas's van and to do a recce, an inspection visit that is, of the man's home from the outside. On the 2nd of July 2022, Belfield ambushed Campbell on his doorstep with the assistance of 2 career criminals, Stephen Cleworth, 38, and Rhys Stephen, 29. Now, there was also a 4th perpetrator who, to this day, remains unidentified and uncaught. Anyway, it took the trio of assailants around 40 seconds to force Thomas into his home, the force that they used on their victim consisting of kicks, punches and whacks. The acts of torture and humiliation that the 3 attackers perpetrated against Thomas over the following 2 hours included their act of stripping the man naked and pouring boiling hot water over his naked bottom. With the gaffer tape that they had bought from B&Q 2 days before, the gang tied Thomas's wrists and ankles up before cutting parallel lines across his face. According to the judge of Belfield's murder trial, which took place from June to July 2025, this was in order to disfigure the victim so that he would feel that, even if he escaped from this ordeal with his life, no woman would ever want him. The assailant's act of dressing with a tourniquet, a stab wound that they had inflicted on Thomas's right arm, which could have killed Thomas, was of course not intended to prevent Thomas from dying. It was simply meant to delay the man's dying. They didn't want Thomas to be relieved by death until they were done savaging him. Thomas had blunt force injuries to his head coming from the abundant punching and kicking that his attackers did to that part of his body. He had injuries to his neck that were caused by strangulation. His numerous knife wounds were by no means limited to his face and right arm. In the course of his 2 hours of torture, the man was dragged from room to room in a bid, it was deemed at trial, for him to show his attackers where his drugs were kept. The judge of Belfield's trial, Mr Justice Garnham of Manchester Crown Court, found as a fact that, leader of the murderous gang, Belfield had enjoyed torturing Thomas. Not only was he eliminating a rival drug dealer, he was revenging himself on both his love rival and the object of the man's affections, his, Belfield's that is, own ex-girlfriend. Mr Justice Garnham's words were, quote, "I have no doubt that the fact that Miss Driver was now the partner of Mr Campbell was an important part of your motivation for what you did on the 2nd of July. You suggested in evidence that you were being sarcastic when you described yourself, by means of emojis, as heartbroken after she took up with Thomas Campbell. I conclude that that is exactly what you felt. You wanted Thomas Campbell to suffer. I have no doubt that you took pleasure from his pain." Unquote. In total, Thomas suffered 61 individual injuries. Just before 1 a.m, the three assailants finally left Thomas's home. At this point, on the verge of death, Thomas mustered up the strength to call 999. Sadly, he was too severely injured to answer the call handler's questions, and moments later, he was no more. The police soon caught up with Cleworth, Stephen and Colleen. Now, having since managed to reach Suriname, Belfield may well have lasted out there if, around November 2022, he hadn't got himself banged up for drug dealing. That is how Greater Manchester Police traced him, and they were waiting for him when, 16 months later, he was released and then promptly shipped home. On the 4th of July 2025 at Bolton Crown Court, Belfield, then aged 31, got life with a minimum of 37 years, minus both the time that he'd spent on remand and, rather surprisingly, the 481 days that he spent in prison in Suriname. This was all because of the diabolical conditions that he suffered in prison in Suriname, conditions which, apparently, make UK prisons feel like a picnic. I don't think Belfield deserved any reduction, but he's still left with nearly 35 years to do. Why Michael Smith, 27, from Liverpool, northwest England, gunned down 36-year-old Rikki Berry on the 17th of July 2024, Adam Williams, 26, and Connor Walsh, 26, having played their part in the murder as well, isn't clear. It could have been due to a drugs dispute, all four parties named being involved in drug dealing, or it could have been due to something else altogether. At 6:30 p.m. on the said date, Smith, who was wearing a balaclava, rode up to Mr Berry's home on an e-bike, where he found Mr Berry in the front garden of the house. He fired 4 shots at Mr Berry, with 3 making contact, and Mr Berry died from a gunshot wound to his chest. While the murder took place, there was a black Seat Alteca waiting on the road. It was being driven by Williams, while Walsh was sitting in the back. Williams and Walsh were both present to oversee the killing, telephone records having shown that the 3 men were in contact with each other in the run-up to the murder. In court, Judge Andrew Menery KC blasted the 3 perpetrators for carrying out their act in broad daylight in a residential street where children play. He also condemned their shocking recklessness, observing that in firing the 4 shots at the victim, they were firing in the direction of the house behind the man. In that house at the time, there were 2 other adults and 2 young children. At least 3 of the bullets whistled on through the house and into the kitchen where Mr. Berry's partner was doing a friend's hair, and so it was only by good fortune that there were no other casualties. In February 2025, Smith, the gunman, got 31 years, while Williams and Walsh, having been found guilty of murder alongside Smith, got 31 and 30 years respectively. Under the legal principles that relate to accessorial liability, that say that a person who takes any part in any offence can be considered and treated as if they were as liable as the person who performed the physical act of the crime, in other words, the principal offender. Given the participation of Williams and Walsh in the planning and the overseeing or supervision of the murder, they are just as guilty of murder as the person who actually shot Mr. Berry dead. They gave him a gun to look after. He tried to sell the piece. He had to pay. According to the police, it was clear in the weeks leading up to his murder that 22-year-old Lucas Sutton, who came from Croydon, South London, realised that he was in danger, but didn't suspect that that danger would come from those that he thought of as his friends. I find that extremely confusing, since surely it would make sense that having betrayed his friends in the way that I described at the very beginning, then none other than his friends would want to get him. I also can't answer why Mr. Sutton took the decision to try to sell the firearm after it was entrusted to him for safekeeping. At around 7 p.m. on the 23rd of May 2023, in response to an invitation from someone that he knew and trusted, Mr. Sutton walked to a flat in Princess Road, Croydon. At the address, he was joined by Kian Williams, age 19, from Coulsdon, and Kai Nelson Palmer, age just 16, from Croydon. Whether Mr. Sutton knew that Williams and Nelson Palmer were going to be there isn't clear, but at some point he left the flat with those 2 to walk to a shop to buy drinks. Unbeknown to Lucas, his 2 friends had been exchanging Snapchat messages in the days leading up to the meeting with the intention of attacking him. As they returned from the shop in Northbrook Road, Williams produced a knife and stabbed Mr. Sutton, who was caught completely off guard and who had just bought both Williams and Nelson Palmer some drinks. After dropping the drinks that he was holding, the victim ran for his life, while Williams and Nelson Palmer followed him in hot pursuit. After Williams stabbed Mr. Sutton again, which he did after catching up with him on Mayor Road, both he and Nelson Palmer took flight. Meanwhile, having burst into a local pub to ask for help, Mr. Sutton collapsed to the floor. After first being treated on the scene by emergency services, who rapidly arrived, Mr. Sutton died a short time later in hospital. For their part, after racing away from Mr. Sutton in the direction of the address where they had originally met, Williams later left the scene in a taxi. I don't know what Nelson Palmer did next. Through CCTV analysis, detectives began to build a picture of the events that had taken place. This showed Williams wearing a distinctive balaclava as he chased Mr. Sutton down the street. A similar item of clothing was later recovered at an address that was linked to Williams. Similarly, investigators were able to trace some of the events that had taken place in the weeks leading up to the attack. On the strength of the evidence available, Williams and Nelson Palmer were arrested in the week following the murder. A subsequent analysis of Nelson Palmer's phone, moreover, revealed the plotting that had taken place between him and Williams. In April 2024, Nelson Palmer, who didn't lay a finger on Mr. Sutton, was no less found guilty of murder, in accordance, I think, with the laws relating to accessorial liability, which say that aiding, abetting, counselling or procuring the commission of a crime can render a person liable to be treated in court like a principal offender, the person who actually performed the physical act of that crime. I think this perpetrator's age at the time of his offence, rather than the fact that he didn't touch Mr. Sutton, is why he only got 16 years, while Williams, who was of course also found guilty of murder, got 23 years. The 2 perpetrators were sentenced in August 2024, but their offences could only be publicised on the 5th of April 2025 because that was when the younger perpetrator turned 18. It looks like Williams, who was legally an adult at the time of his act, was allowed to remain anonymous for as long as his co-defendant was, so as not to jeopardise his co-defendant's anonymity. In something of a twist to this very sad and horrifying story, on the 3rd of April 2025, a 19-year-old man was acquitted at the Old Bailey of Mr. Sutton's murder. As well as being a son, a grandson, a brother and a partner, Mr. Sutton was a father. His young son will now never know his dad. If this video has gripped you, I recommend you to watch this one next. I'll meet you there.